I'm Michael Peel, as you've been told, European diplomatic correspondent of the Financial Times, based in Brussels. And the clock is already ticking in front of us, I think, because everything's running late. We only have 20 minutes, so I'm not going to waste any time. It's my great pleasure to introduce Thomas Greminger, who is the Secretary General of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and a veteran Swiss diplomat who has worked on conflict mediation around the world during his career, including in Colombia, Sri Lanka, and Uganda. So, Thomas, welcome, first of all, and as our host said, the subject in hand today is the importance of multilateral dialogue in the current challenging international environment. Challenging is a bit of an understatement, isn't it? A diplomatic word. I mean, multilateralism is falling apart in some ways, isn't it? And how do you see it at the OSCE, and how do you cope with this retreat from multilateralism we see in many parts of the world, and this return, as many people see it, to a world of great power competition?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A pleasure to be here. Yes, clearly, also in the OSCE area, the OSCE spanning an area from Vancouver to Vladivostok, so basically covering Europe, North America, and the entire ex-Soviet Union. We feel that multilateralism is under pressure. There is a historic low in trust among the key stakeholders of European security. That basically means Russia and the West. To put it simply, we see the arms control architecture that has been built up over the last 3 decades unraveling, falling apart. We see conflict, armed conflict, having come back to Europe. The crisis in and around Ukraine has an armed conflict aspect in the Donbass. There is fighting as we speak. And of course, we feel also the return of unilateralism, of bilateral, transactional approaches, while our tools are perhaps less fashionable than they've been a while ago.
So you mentioned arms control there, and I think this is a very important point, because it's perhaps not widely realized quite how much trouble there is, in that we've seen, of course, the collapse of the INF medium-range missiles treaty between the United States and Russia, but there are now also worries about the future of the New START treaty, which is due to expire soon, and then looking forward, there's a review of the non-proliferation treaty due next year, isn't there? I mean, can you just give the audience a sense of how serious you see these challenges on arms control, and what an organization like the OSCE, which brings together more than 50 countries, after all, could do to help?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I think we find ourselves again at the brink of a new nuclear arms race, and I think the demise of INF is extremely serious. We are still hopeful that the same is not going to happen to a New START. This is the nuclear side, but we, from an OSCE perspective, we would very much also look at the conventional side. And here the picture is similar. It is perhaps less visible, less on politicians' agenda, which does not make it less worrisome. Basically, the biggest and most important treaty on conventional forces in Europe is not being implemented anymore. The Vienna document outlining confidence and security building measures is still being implemented by and large, but many of its provisions have been agreed immediately after the Cold War. So in a way, it's a document that is direly in need of modernization, and currently there is no consensus on doing that. And we are again talking about managing military risk in Europe on OSCE platforms. We are talking about military transparency, about military incident prevention and management. And I would argue 8-10 years ago, we would have thought that these topics are obsolete. They're not going to come back to Europe. And today we find ourselves in midst of very serious conversations about military risk again.
Mm. So you have this organization which brings together European countries, Russia, North American countries. You're in a very special and precious place, but at the same time, as you say, there are these huge disagreements and tensions, whether it's over the conflict in Ukraine or the Iran nuclear deal or whatever. The OSCE is more or less involved in various of these subjects. Can you just give the audience a sense of how do you do multilateralism in an increasingly unilateral age? How do you get people to work together? How do you try to rebuild that confidence?
Well, we offer a platform for dialogue, and I think it is fair to say that, unfortunately, we are probably the last really inclusive platform for dialogue where you have Russia and the West sitting at the same table. That is an offer to states. Now, what states make out of this offer, that is, of course, a different story. And I would say currently, clearly not enough. We have a broad range of tools. We have developed confidence-building measures. We have a toolbox for preventing, managing, and resolving conflict. Again, these tools are out there. We try to market them. We try to make them also fit for today's security challenges. But then, well, they need to be picked up. They need to be used by states. Now, the picture is not entirely bleak. I would, for instance, want to refer to recent progress in addressing the crisis in around Ukraine. We've seen over the last 2, 3, 4 months clearly progress in implementing the Minsk agreements. This is the peace plan for Eastern Ukraine. We have seen progress in another protracted conflict in the OSCE area, the Transnistrian settlement process. So if there is political will, if there is smart support by an international organization like the OSCE in terms of mediation support, in terms of offering these spaces for dialogue, I think there can be progress.
President Emmanuel Macron has been very outspoken about challenges to international security and European security lately. Obviously, he's attracted mixed reviews, I think it's fair to say. He's also called for a rethink of European security architecture to make sure Russia is included. Not every European country agrees with that. How do you see it? I mean, is this something that is helpful to have a world leader who is trying to shake things up a bit and perhaps trying to address some of these big questions that we're talking about?
Clearly, there is no European security without Russia. So we need to find a way to bring Russia back into a European security order that is supported by all key security stakeholders. What is also clear, this can only happen when there is progress in dealing with the crisis in around Ukraine. This is such an important conflict bearing on trust between East and the West. Without progress there, we won't, be capable of really, again, talking about a strengthened common European security architecture. I think basically the principles are out there and nobody questions the principles that have been agreed to in the Helsinki Final Accord 1975. There have been, over time, very different understandings of what these principles imply. And so I think we need to come back to a common understanding of these principles and commitments. And what I find in President Macron's statements lately is he picks up many of these elements that you would find, for instance, in the Charter of Paris that has been agreed 29 years ago. We're going to commemorate the 30th anniversary next year. And it basically is all about approaching security challenges in a cooperative way. So it's cooperative security that is again being brought to the forefront by President Macron. And this, of course, I would very much appreciate from my perspective.
So if I could just for a moment bring us down from the geopolitical level to perhaps a more personal question. As I mentioned at the start, you've done conflict mediation in various parts of the world between parties between whom there was often great bitterness and anger. What did you learn? What are the main lessons you learned about the human and political factors that need to be taken into account? And how can they help with our attempts to rebuild multilateralism today?
I think important aspects in conflict facilitation, conflict mediation are impartiality, empathy, a capacity to listen, a capacity to take a side seriously, a capacity to provide spaces where parties feel secure. And I think what is also very important is that you realize that as a mediator, you can only do as much as providing very solid mediation support to a process, but at the end it is up to the sides to master the political will to make all those concessions that are necessary to move forward in resolving a conflict. So you somehow, as a mediator, as a facilitator, you need to be capable to keep a certain distance to the process. And don't get frustrated if there is no movement. I mean, look at the conflict in eastern Ukraine. There has now been years of stagnation. We basically operated two major conflict management tools, the Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine, a huge civilian operation that monitors what is happening, the ceasefire violations, but also facilitates local ceasefires. On the one hand, to make sure that ceasefires don't spin out of control, and on the other hand, to allow for humanitarian repair work. Thanks to these windows of silence, these local ceasefires, millions of people on both sides of the line of contact still have access to water, electricity, etc. So this is only conflict management. It's not very satisfactory in terms of you're not moving towards resolving the conflict. At the same time, it's extremely important to contain a conflict, and it's extremely important also to alleviate human suffering by, providing these services that we have been providing. But of course, if you do this for 5 years, you ask yourself, well, isn't this ever going to end? I negotiated the Special Monitoring Mission mandate in 2014, and when I did so, I thought, well, this is going to be an operation for the next 6 to 9 months, and then it will be gone. And now, 5 years later, this is OSCE's largest, by far largest operation.
When you, obviously, we've been celebrating, marking the fall of the Berlin Wall, the 30th anniversary recently. When you look back at what people felt then and where we are now in terms of multilateralism and cooperation or lack of it, are you surprised where we've ended up?
Of course, 30 years ago, we hoped that we would move, not least our organization, towards an organization that is an organization based on common values. And initially in the first years of the 90s, the organization also managed to agree on a number of commitments in areas that today would consider politically extremely sensitive when it comes to respect for human rights, democratic institutions, rule of law, basically also agreeing that there is a right to look into the human rights situation of another country. This was agreed back then. Imagine this today, we would never be capable of achieving consensus on this. So in that sense, we have been moving back to a much more confrontational world again. Values have been diverging and not converging. We realize that we did not witness the end of history in the early 90s.
We just have a few minutes left, and I'd like to perhaps spend them by talking about another angle of OSCE's work, which is looking at emerging threats, ranging from terrorism to climate change. And perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about that, and particularly focusing on climate change and how, what are the security threats, and what is the kind of multilateral response that an organization like the OSCE can help to promote?
Yeah. Well, I'm very glad that you raised these threats that we call transnational threats. Because when I talk about a crisis and conflict management, obviously I do this against the backdrop of combating a number of transnational threats, supporting our member states in dealing with them. And here I would refer to, yes, countering terrorism, preventing violent extremism, combating trafficking of all sorts, trafficking in human beings, arms, drugs. Then, of course, cybersecurity is a huge issue. Cybercrime is an issue. And then, yes, the nexus between the repercussions of climate change on security, the repercussions of migration on security, these are issues that don't stop at any border and that can only be tackled in cooperation. And we've been serving as a platform to exchange, well, to map challenges, to exchange on best practices, and we offer expertise. We do a lot of capacity building in states, but certainly less for member states of the European Union. They have their own support, but when it comes to Southeastern Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, here we see a lot of demand in helping these states deal with these challenges, and this, of course, is also very much linked to technological change, modern technology. I overheard references to artificial intelligence in the previous panel, and that obviously has also a very important bearing on us. Criminals are very smart in using modern technologies. Traffickers, for instance, they're extremely skillful in using the internet for their business, and terrorists are extremely smart in using the internet for recruiting, mobilizing, funding their operations. And I think we have to make sure that we, the good guys, also, are capable of using these technologies. And one approach, for instance, on trafficking in human beings is that we work very closely together with tech companies. We have launched an initiative that is entitled Tech Against Trafficking, and so gradually, I think, we'll also be in a position to develop responses that match the scale of the challenge that we face in trafficking in human beings.
So the clock has ticked on remorselessly, so I'd like to finish with one very quick question. After all these years, are you still an optimist on conflict resolution, and if so, why?
There is always, fortunately, we have a portfolio that is broad enough to have areas where you see progress, where there is movement. I referred to two, and this also allows you to better deal with those areas where, you see stagnation, you see backsliding, causing frustration, etc. But fortunately, there are also positive dynamics. And also geographically, if I look at the OSCE area, for instance, lately, something that has been largely, has not probably been recognized, particularly here in Europe, is progress in Central Asia. A state like Uzbekistan that has been very close for decades, all of a sudden opened up, created a dynamic in an entire region, and all of a sudden you see regional cooperation blooming in Central Asia. And this is something, of course, that is very rewarding.
So that sounded like not yes or no, but maybe.
Absolutely.
Thomas Greminger, thank you very much. Please show your appreciation.